What is up, Fixler here for Thomann synthesizers, and today I'm going to show you how I create more interesting and rich pad sounds with various layers of complexity using sound design methods and FX. And in this case I'm going to use the Prophet Rev-2 by Dave Smith and the Eventide H90, but any comparable software or hardware does the job pretty much. All of these principles would apply equally. So let's go. Alright, so here we go with the Prophet Rev-2, and this right here is more or less the sound that I'm aiming for. Obviously this is still super dry, there's no effects applied yet, but there's already some complexity going on because the individual voices are panned in the stereo field. So if you listen with headphones, you're going to notice. That the individual voices appear randomly in different parts of the stereo image. And then also there's a lot of complex pseudo-randomness movement going on in the overtone structure. And a lot of dissonance that we can play with. And yeah, this is going to be a great basis to make even more complex later on with effects. But first, let me give you a super quick overview of the Prophet Rev-2 in case you're unfamiliar, just so you can follow along better. It's a polyphonic synth. In my case, it's the 8-voice version. There's also a 16-voice version, and you can also update the 8-voice version to a 16-voice version. But for most use cases, so far it's been enough for me. What do we have here? A modulation matrix, allowing us to cross-modulate all sorts of stuff. A sequencer, 2 LFOs, the main oscillator section with 2 oscillators. Here this filter section with a filter envelope. Here the regular envelope for the volume. And an additional envelope that we can map to anything we like. And an effects section that I rarely use. That's it, basically, pretty much basic functionality. So now, let me create a basic new patch with nothing applied to it. One disclaimer before we start. I actually did sort of like a software modification almost to my Prophet Rev-2 by pre-programming something into the gated sequencer. It's too complicated to explain in this video, but I'm going to link a beautiful article in the description. So if you want to match this sound exactly, just follow the advice in the article that I link below. What it does basically is whenever I hit a note, some of you are going to perceive it, the pitch is always going to be slightly different randomly, but just a few cents, and independent for each voice. Super subtle, but I think it makes a big difference, especially with polyphonic chords. And then another thing that you might notice, there's a MIDI effect on right now, so it doesn't just play the note itself, but it also always plays the fifth. And I have this as a MIDI effect on right now. That's the sound I'm going for here, but I didn't want to use an oscillator for it, so just solved it as a MIDI effect. All right, now let's start by working on this empty patch here. First, let's select the waveform, sawtooth, and for the other one, I'm going to select the pulse width, the pulse. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shape and modulate this movement, but for both shapes together, synchronized. So I'm going to use the modulation matrix and go here, an empty mod slot. Just hold source, press LFO1. It's now mapped. I'm going to select the full amount, 127, and then oscillator all shape. So now the shape of both oscillators is going to be modulated by LFO1. We're going to hear now. Beautiful. And now what I could do is I could take the second LFO and map the first LFO to it. So I'm going to go in here, select LFO2 as the source and LFO1 frequency as the destination. And now there's going to be a subtle interplay between the it's very subtle, but now the rate of the pulse width modulation is not consistent anymore. It changes slightly. Just adding some more complexity. That's hard to notice, but makes a subtle difference. Alright, now this obviously sounds way too harsh, so we're gonna finally start filtering that stuff and applying a filter envelope that is pad-like, so a lot of attack. So the filter slowly opens up over time, a lot of decay, so it takes a bit to arrive at the sustained position, which is going to be medium. Yeah, so this is roughly what I'm going for. Then I'm going to apply some attack for the actual volume as well. And a bit of release, so when I release the key, it still takes a moment to end, but not too long. Yeah, this feels natural. Then I'm going to apply some key tracking here to the filter. This means that when I press a lower note, as opposed to a higher note, right now the filter position is equal. But once I activate key tracking, higher notes are going to have a higher cutoff position, which often sounds more natural because that's what would happen on acoustical instruments. The higher notes would usually have more present overtones as well. Right, that's it for the basic filter shape, more or less. Maybe a bit of velocity, so whenever I press the key harder, the filter opens up more. And now let's move on to the panning. This is actually super easy. I'm just going to activate the pan spread here, and now suddenly it's going to pan the voices all over the place. Yeah, if you're listening with headphones, you're gonna hear how each of the individual voices suddenly spreads out. And especially for this sound, it's gonna be super important because the whole thing that I really like about it is how the overtones are varying per voice in a different way. And we're gonna now introduce this movement. Let's first mix the two oscillators by 50% so that we hear both oscillators. And now let's start to use the audio mode here, which basically uses the actual frequency of the oscillators to modulate the cutoff frequency. And this is so quick because it's not an LFO, but actually audio rate, that we're going to perceive the super fast movement of the filter as overtones. So listen how these additional overtones appear once I start to engage audio mode. Yeah, so suddenly there's some irregular movement and independent for each voice. The audio rate depends on the actual pitch of the note, so the movement is going to be different and the overtones are going to be different per voice. Super beautiful. And this also especially works with the pan spread, because were I to have it in mono, the effect is still beautiful but not as magnificent as in the case where every voice has its own space. Yeah, super magnificent already, but now let's add even more sloppiness by using the legendary slop knob here, which is meant to simulate the vintage behavior of old school synths that have somewhat unstable pitch. But the gated sequencer method that are linked in the descriptions is far superior because it's on a per voice basis, and this is making the oscillator sloppy on a global scale for all voices equally. But for the purposes of this patch, it's still an interesting feature because we can use it in a performative way. So now with the slop knob, we can control the structure of these overtones in a sense, because of the complex relation of the pitch of the sound and the filter movement. And now there's 3 knobs basically that can be used in a performative way. The filter cutoff, the audio mod, create these overtones individually, and the slop knob to create even more dissonance from time to time. Yeah, super lovely. So I think that's it for the basic patch. I'm going to do some audio recordings of it, and then we're going to start to process it. Alright, so now let's try and see how we can further spice the sound up with some effects. In this case, I'm going to use the Eventide H90, which must be my new favorite hardware effect. But before that, let's have a look at my Ableton and how I've set it up here. So first, as you can see, I actually did some recordings here of the Prophet, and I have it set up on 3 individual tracks. So it's actually the same audio recording, but with different starting points. So this one starts here, this one starts here, and this one starts here. But obviously the chord progression is properly aligned, but it just repeats. What's the benefit of that? I basically just tripled the amount of voices that are playing the same chord progression, but each instance of it has some tiny alterations, and the starting point is a tiny bit different, and the oscillators are wobbling a tiny bit different. So this is almost like a little orchestra of Prophet voices right now. And yeah, this is how it sounded before. It's already stereo, but this way it's much richer. And as you can see, I've set up this filter here, some control. And then here, which is called Eventide H90, this is just an instance of the external audio effect here in Ableton. And there I just selected the corresponding in and outputs of the Eventide. But I already set it up here. And then I can just use the Eventide just like an effects plugin. Alright, now let's have a look at the Eventide itself. This right here is the preset that I built. Which is adding 2 more layers of complexity. A delay with a lot of resonance, and a shimmer reverb, adding sounds up an octave and 2 octaves above the original sound. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move here over to the next preset, and then I'm just going to recreate the sound from scratch. So, the basic layout here, very simple, as I already mentioned. It's basically the Eventide H9, but twice. Meaning I can load one of the many Eventide algorithms onto the A slot and one of them onto the B slot, and the browsing is fairly simple. So onto the A slot, I'm going to load the delay sound, and to find what I'm looking for here, I have this fairly efficient way of browsing. I type in first that I want only the factory presets, then only the delay sounds, and then which delay algorithm exactly. In this case, I want the band delay algorithm. And now it's just browsing through only the presets using this algorithm. I think mine was Over the Rainbow, as if I remember correctly. Now, this is the delay sound that we have, which is lovely. And if I were now to browse through the parameters, I have various pages here letting me control all of the parameters that would be on the dedicated individual Eventide pedals as well. I have to select all of them here using these 3 knobs and browsing with this one. And what I want to control right now, a bit of the feedback, and especially here the modulation. I want to crank it way up using a lot of resonance and a lot of mod depth. Yeah, giving me almost this dub delay kind of sound, but a bit more futuristic. And then maybe also increase the feedback a bit. Yeah, and I think this is pretty lovely. Now let's work on the dry-wet mix. And the mod frequency could be a bit slower. Yes, beautiful. Now we have this whole another layer, this moving figure in the higher frequencies. Which also beautifully interacts with my manual control of the filter here in Ableton. Lovely. Alright, so up next, let's move on to the second slot. And here I only want to select factory, reverb, and then only the shimmer reverb presets. And now it's browsing only through these. And I think the one that I selected was also just called shimmer. And now let's try to dial in the perfect settings here. This is what it sounds like by default. As you can hear, if I just open the filter for a very short moment, we have a huge, beautiful, complex tail already. Listen to this. Pretty insane. But now let's have a look at the individual parameters. Obviously mix, decay, and size. This makes a big difference. Yeah, this should be large enough. And then here I can work on the frequency distribution a bit. I want lower decay time in the lower frequencies and higher decay time in the higher frequencies. Not to muddy up the bottom too much. And here on this page you can see the actual pitch of the additional pitched up reverb signal. 1200 cents, that's obviously an octave, 12 semitones. But as you can see, we have pitch A and B, so 2 individual instances of the pitched up signal. And by default, which is pretty smart, they are not perfectly at a perfect octave at 1200 cent, but rather one of them is slightly above by 4 cent and one of them is slightly below by 7 cent, because this way it sounds more organic and more beautiful, just if they are not perfectly aligned pitch-wise, but there's some imperfection, much more interesting. But what I could also do is I could select something around 1900, which would be an octave and a fifth. And as you can see, it jumps always from more or less this area around 0 to more or less 500 cents to more or less a fifth. And then always around these key points here, you have the more precise control. Then it jumps to an octave, and then you have this octave and a fifth, etc. You get the idea. So you don't have to dial in all of the cents, or you have to not skip through every single cent, but it intelligently jumps around the most interesting points harmonically. And I think 1 octave and 2 octaves could also sound interesting. And I think that is a fairly interesting, super complex sound using the H90, and the Ableton Auto filter gives me a lot of control. Yeah. Alright, that's it. Alright, and lastly, before I forget it, in case you don't want to spend as much money as on a Prophet Rev-2, I cannot recommend the Yamaha Reface CS enough. It's completely digital, but as the name suggests, it aims at capturing the essence of the old CS80, CS70 Yamaha synths in a super compact form factor. And although it's completely digital, I absolutely love the sound of it. And as you can hear already, it's beautiful for creating super complex pad sounds. And yeah, it's really hands-on. There's no menu diving, nothing like that. Just what you see here. You have just one envelope, ADSR, but you can balance it between being a pure amp envelope, a pure filter envelope, and something in the middle, which affects both the filter cutoff and the amplitude. Then here you have an LFO that can be mapped to the following destinations. And what is most interesting and what makes this unique is this oscillator section here, where you have this texture fader and the modulation fader. And with the use of these two, you can create some super complex overtones by, I don't know, I guess audio rate modulation, creating some sort of harmonic overtone structure that's harmonically pleasing and interesting. And it's really interesting to look for a sweet spot between these two faders, and then pretty much you're going to have a super unique sound that's not so easy to replicate. And it's super complex. And then lastly, of course, you also have a built-in effect section here. As you might already hear, I have an external reverb on the Yamaha right now, but that's it. And everything else is from inside the box. And here you have this effect section with a delay, which is beautiful. As you can hear, you can manipulate the pitch because it has this tape delay kind of functionality where the pitch depends on the alteration of the rate fader. And then classic phaser sound. Chorus flanger. And distortion. I think right now I'm going for the phaser here. Yeah, just to let you know. Alright, I guess that's it from my side for today. In case you have any more questions, as usual, let me know in the comments and I'm trying to get back to you ASAP. Apart from that, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Peace out.